Ukraine could face defeat in 2024. Here's how that might look. I saw this article and it was shocking to me, not only the source of the article, but it was shocking the headline. You know, for months and months, we were told that it was guaranteed that Russia would lose. For months and months, I mean, years, I mean, at this point in the conflict, we've been told that Russia would collapse economically, that they would collapse militarily, that the defense secretary of the United States came on and said the goal of this is to strategically weaken Russia. That was what they said to the public. I mean, this is what has been going on in the media for years now. And all of a sudden, even the most, I would say, biased outlets, Western outlets, have had to concede that on the ground, things are not what we were told, but more specifically, and you know, our focus is on the economics of things. Yes, there's a military and there's a geopolitical aspect to all of this, but we're focused on the economic impact. The impact to the global economy is clear. The impact to the strategic systems that the interplay between nations, it's clear that from a strategic standpoint, we've got to look at this and come to the realization that Russia has succeeded where we were told over and over again for years that they would certainly fail. I mean, I looked at this article, Los Angeles Times, Ukrainians contemplate the ones unthinkable losing the war with Russia. It's amazing that even Western media has had to come out and they don't admit that they misled us because many people said this from the beginning. They don't admit that they deceived us and that it was clear that the signs for what we were being told was not true. It's clear that all of the information that the politicians were providing was not true. And they still continue to pump out article after article to try to build public support for this effort, irregardless of the human capital, the human toll that it would take on Ukraine, the human toll that it would take on Russia, the human toll that it would take on the world, the economic devastation that it would unleash all throughout Europe, countries like Germany and Spain and other countries that were depending on Russian resources, and the fact that we were never told there was an off-ramp before this conflict even began, that there were deals on the table over and over, but that leaders in the West found it to be advantageous to have a conflict with Russia, that instead of taking the serious proposals and making counter proposals and trying to reach a resolution, they thought it was in their best interest to have a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. And they focused their efforts not on resolving the tensions, but on preparing for war, while Russia was still in a negotiating stance or a negotiating frame of mind. And the question is, what did it achieve? Now, don't be misled. There are always those who continue to hold on to the party line, that Russia is sure to lose in Ukraine. There's always those outlets. This is from The Economist. There's always those individuals that are going to continue to hold on to that line, even though all of the data, I mean, it reminds me of Baghdad Bob. Even when the American tanks were riding through the city, he was still claiming victory in Iraq. There's always those holdouts who, for some reason or another, continue to hold on to a line that everyone in the world, even they should know, no longer is true and no longer can be true, because the facts on the ground, the images, are you going to believe your lying eyes? The images that we are seeing coming out of not only Ukraine, but the images and the stories that we are seeing, the reports that are coming out of from all over the world about the geopolitical shifts that are occurring. It's clear to us that from a strategic standpoint, at this point, regardless of whatever happens on the ground, if it becomes a stalemate, if it stalls out, whatever happens on the ground, it is clear to me that a strategic victory has been won by Russia. Vladimir Putin, look at this story. Vladimir Putin is losing Russia's long war against Ukrainian identity. Yes, in some ways that still focus specifically on the war itself. And I want us to step back and to ask ourselves, what were the strategic aims beyond what the day-to-day on the battlefield, beyond the territorial exchanges? What was the strategy that was employed by the West, and has that strategy bared fruit? Have they been able to isolate Russia? Have they been able to weaken its military complex and defense industry? Have they been able to weaken its economy such that that there would be this overthrow of the? You heard stories that Putin would be overthrown by the citizens because of the sanctions and the bans and the cutting off from the SWIFT. Has any of that happened? And if not, then the question is, what has been achieved by the West, and what has been achieved more particularly by Russia beyond the war, beyond the day-to-day grind? What has been achieved by either side? And I think to understand this, we've got to have an understanding of the difference between strategy and tactics. Strategy is a long-term thing. It's a global perspective of how you want to shape the world and how a country wants to position itself to further its economic, its political, its military, its security interests. Tactics are the day-to-day tools that help to bolster the strategy. Tactics in and of themselves. Sanctions is a tactic. It's not a strategy. And I think the West oftentimes forgets that. It has many tools in its toolbox, but because there's no coherent strategy at play over a long period of time, not over short windows, and that's one of the problems with the bouncing back within the West between political parties. The strategies don't have time to materialize because the leaderships change and the politics change. And so what you see is a dependence on tactics that don't lead to long-term objectives and the achievement of goals. I did a video about China 2025. China in 2015 launched an manufacturing push to shift their economy from real estate to as the driver to manufacturing and industrial robotics as the key components of their future economy. And now you see Janet Yellen over in China complaining about overproduction and complaining about what the Chinese government is doing and how it's unfair and they can't. Well, the question is, what was the American strategy for its workers, for its people, for the long-term development of the economy, not the administration by administration tactics that are employed, but export bans on semiconductors, export bans and tariffs and all the other stuff. Those are tactics. Those are not long-term strategies. And when we look at the conflict in Russia, what we see is, and I want to give you 3 reasons Russia has achieved a strategic victory over the West. 3 reasons why, from a strategic standpoint, not a tactical standpoint, not the day-to-day, who's bombing who has this city and where the battle lines are drawn, but from a strategic standpoint, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why Russia has achieved several key goals throughout this conflict. Let me pause here and stop and thank you for watching. I do appreciate you watching the channel, even if you haven't made it to the first reason, just the fact that you've chosen to click on the video and watch the channel. I want to thank you for that. I want to also ask that you like, that you follow, that you share the content so that the community can grow. Let's jump into reason 1. Military and defense industry. That's the first reason that Russia has achieved a strategic victory. Do you remember the stories when that were out in the media that they would run out of artillery shells, that they would run out of weapons, they would run out of missiles? And yes, it is true that there were shortages, that there were moments of tension, but through all of that, Russia showed that it had the capacity to go toe-to-toe with the entire collective West. And not only to go toe-to-toe, but to outpace in the area of production and providing weaponry on the battlefield. That is one of the consistent complaints and problems with Ukraine, is the fact that the European allies and partners lack. It has demonstrated a strength on Russian side and demonstrated a weakness that the entire world is taking note of. You know, if you want to make allies in the world, you have to show yourself to be strong. You have to show yourself to have capacity. And that's something that Russia has done. And so you're trying to isolate Russia, but as long as Russia is able to prove and to show their capacity, there will always be those who seek to form alliances, especially where the West has made a habit of using sanctions and pressure tactics instead of negotiations as the main form of diplomacy. You're going to find that there are so many people that you've isolated that those people then are able to come together and form their own military and economic bloc. I did a video on Russia, Iran, and China, this new iron triangle. And the truth of the matter is none of those countries had to be in a military alliance, in an economic alliance separate from the West. They did not pose a threat to Western hegemony. They did not pose a threat to the United States and to the political order, the United States led rules-based order. They didn't pose a threat to that. Iran signed a deal, the nuclear agreement deal that the United States backed out of. China consistently has tried to say, hey, let's back off of creating all these military bases on our border and let's return to the one China policy, which was the policy throughout the world for years, decades. Russia said, hey, we don't need NATO on our doorsteps. Let's negotiate this. But it's the thinking that all problems can be solved through pressure, through intervention, through military aid. You know, these countries were not the types of countries that a little aid and a stirring up opposition would cause the countries to collapse, or pressure tactics through sanctions or export bans or any of the other nonsense that the West employs against smaller, more vulnerable countries. And so what has ended up happening is they formed their own coalition. Putin calls for closer Russia-China cooperation on military satellites and prospective weapons. Essentially, the NATO has created another bloc by its actions, its unwillingness to negotiate, its unwillingness to resolve disputes without the use of punitive measures and come to the table not as a bully, as a global a threat to peace and security, but as a partner to establish peace and security, which was originally its mandate, but it has become something else under this Davos crowd, I call them, this new crowd of leadership that is leading the Western world really right into down a endless pit of disaster and what will be and continue to be isolation and fragmentation on the world scene. This alliance between Russia and China was not an alliance that was inevitable. It was an alliance that was created mainly by the West, continued pressure tactics against these two individuals. China, Russia, Iran, maritime drills send signal to West. This is something, so you talk about a strategic victory. You tried to isolate Russia, but that didn't work because the West has already tried to isolate too many other countries. And this is the problem. These are tactics without a strategy. How do we resolve these disputes rather than making long-term fissures within the global community that then creates its own pact or its own alliance to challenge no one asked that question. These guys who are leading the Western countries didn't ask the question that if we continue to isolate different countries, what will happen if they come together militarily? What will happen when you bring the manufacturing capacity of China together with the technological capacity of Russia, with the technology and the vibrance and youth that exist in Iran? What happens when you put the religious fervor of one country with the manufacturing, with the technology of it, all three together? What's going to happen on the global stage? And then when you merge that with other states, other countries who have also been and throughout Africa and other places who have become victims of Western sanctions and pressure tactics and victims of coups and interference in local politics. What happens when you've made enough enemies on the world stage to where your enemies begin to come together? Well, and that's essentially what's happening. And what Russia is doing is showing that it will be a valuable partner militarily, not just in this war, but they're showing that they can go toe to toe with NATO. Not a full on assault with all of the countries of NATO attacking it, but in a proxy war, that they are a viable option as a strategic partner, that they are strong enough to defend their interests and to engage in combat, even against high level technology, against high level influx of weaponry and resources and money, that they can stand toe to toe. They're nothing to sneeze at. And without the United States, really, the European partners have proven and have shown a remarkable, I mean, you hear Macron and you hear Sunak and you hear all of these individuals talking, drumming up the war machine and beating the war drum. But the reality is, when you look at it, they have very little to offer to Ukraine. Without the United States backing this effort, it falls apart immediately. And this is shocking because this is Europe against one country. And without the U.S., Europe doesn't have the military capacity to help a European ally. This is not the United States is shipping stuff from across the ocean. These are countries that are contiguous, countries that have borders, some of which with Ukraine, and they are not able to push Ukraine over the top. To the contrary, on the battlefield, from a tactical standpoint, it doesn't seem that Ukraine is currently in a position of advancing and reclaiming land. What we see more in the day-to-days is that Ukraine is losing land, losing manpower, and is struggling to keep up with the demands, this aggressive attrition that is taking place on the battlefield. So if you're looking for a partner, you've not weakened Russia's ability to make partners in defense compacts and defense agreements with other countries. You've only strengthened their ability because you've lifted their profile on the world stage. We thought perhaps that they could stand toe-to-toe against NATO. But now we know for a fact that they can put up a strong resistance against the Western allies. And this is why you see China moving closer to Russia. This is why you see Iran seeing Russia as a viable partner in this pushback against Western hegemony. Iran and Russia enter a new level of military cooperation. Iran and Russia over the years were not strategic partners, especially militarily. They had their back and forth. They had their moments of good relations and moments of not so good relations. But now, because of what the West has done to Iran and the stances that the United States has taken, first under President Trump, and then later on Biden continued it, not wanting to seem weak on any foreign policy issue. It has created a situation where now you've put Iran and Russia together militarily. When they needed arms, when they needed support, they went to Iran. Iran was willing to do it, but they are also asking for technology and asking for support. And so now, with both of these militaries working together, I think that Iran's drone industry and their unmanned vehicles, their other industries and their missiles and intercontinental ballistic missile programs will advance rapidly because of the sharing of technology, the sharing of capacity. And it's not just with Iran and Russia, it's with Iran, Russia, and China in that mix, all of which have been isolated by the West. We see this. Iran's rise as global arms supplier vexes U.S. and its allies. You've got two of the world's arms suppliers in Iran and in Russia working together. And when you add China to that mix, you have a defense industry that is strong enough to keep pace with, see, because combat is not just about what happens on the battlefield. Combat, and oftentimes, is decided by the production capacity of the different countries. How many artillery shells can you bring to bear? How many can you replace? Can you replace the tanks? Can you replace the infantry fighting vehicles? Can you replace the personal equipment of soldiers and be able to provide them with the type of equipment necessary for them to function on the battlefield? Is your economy, is your defense industry strong enough to do that? And when you match up Russia, Iran, China, and you start to add other countries to that mix, what you will find is now you have a more formidable threat than you had before the Ukraine war. And so, from a strategic standpoint, from a military standpoint, from a defense standpoint, truth of the matter is, Russia is stronger now because of its own ramp up internally, but its connection and interconnection with others who have also been isolated by the West. The drones, you can say what you want about Iran technology, but those drones during a crucial period of time where it looked like it could be true that Russia would lose the war, Iran came in with equipment, with support, with drones, and with other technology to help bolster Russia while it regrouped. And Russia did regroup, and they just needed the breathing room. But Russia and Iran as a force together was something that the West has created. So from a strategic standpoint, it's a strategic failure on the West, but a strategic victory by Russia and Iran. Russia's war economy expands more than forecast despite sanctions. GDP expanded 4.9% in second quarter, topping most forecasts. Not only did the Russian economy not collapse, but the Russian defense industry ramped up and proved that the Soviet war machine is still alive. Their ability to create tanks, their ability to respond to what's happening on the battlefield, their ability to improvise and to create new solutions and deploy those solutions on real time while the conflict is going on to provide greater survivability, greater lethality on the battlefield is apparent not just to the West, but it's apparent to the global South and to those who would seek to partner with Russia in the future. And from that standpoint, they have proven not only their capacity to produce, but they've proven the effectiveness of the materials that they are providing, in the future. They can say we've had these weapons that we have proven will work against NATO, that we've proven they will work on the modern battlefield. No country has in the modern era has fought a near peer ally. Most of the times NATO and the United States and the Western partners have fought against countries whose military were not equal technologically, manpower wise, strategically. They were not equals. And as a result, it was an overwhelming success. But a near peer ally, what countries have had to face near peer conflict where both sides had access to weaponry, to technology, to air defense, to air force, air assets? What modern conflict has had that besides the Ukraine war? No, none of them. And Russia can say not only do we have the know-how, but our equipment, our defense industry was able to produce equipment that lasted and achieved goals on the battlefield. And if you're in the market to purchase equipment, you want to purchase equipment that you can A, afford, and B, that you know will work. And so from that standpoint, Russia has achieved another strategic goal, and that their defense industry, while there's predictions that the defense industry will decline after the war, while the defense industry might not be what it is now, Russia will have plenty of clients worldwide ready and willing and able to purchase military hardware that has been proven in combat. They will line up around the corner trying to get equipment from Russia. So in that standpoint, it has been a strategic victory. Russia's economy is increasingly structured around its war in Ukraine. And while that's not going to always be the case, the Russian defense industry will I think, has been propelled by light years. While the goal was to weaken Russian defense industry and Russia's defense capacity by putting it under pressure, sometimes if you want to weaken something, you let it atrophy on its own. But when you stir it and you put it under pressure and it has to exert its energy, then it grows as a result of the vitality and the resources that it's being given. Same thing with China and the chips. The export ban only forced China to invest resources and to try to close the gap faster. So it may be a short-term strain, but long-term, the only thing that the United States has done is ensure that China will become a major semiconductor hub in the future world. And that future is not that far off. The same thing can be said for the defense industry. By the pressure that the West has placed on the defense industry in Russia, it has caused it to grow, to begin to innovate, to learn. And, not only are they learning from their mistakes, but they have captured Western equipment and have it in labs studying the material content, studying the systems that operate those tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and other military hardware that have been captured on the battlefield. From another point where there's been strategic victory by Russia is economic resilience. Russia has proven that its economy is not as fragile as the West thought. After 2 years of war, Russian economy proves resilient, but for how long? And I think that the question is that we were told over and over again, by seizing Russia's reserves, an unprecedented step, by cutting Russia off from SWIFT, an unprecedented step, by placing sanctions not just on Russia, but sanctions on companies that do business with Russia that are not located in Russia, that are in third countries, India, China, and throughout the world, that this would be a crippling effect, that their economy would topple, that the ruble would just turn to dust in the hands of Russian consumers. It'd have no value whatsoever. None of this happened. And so from a strategic standpoint, what Russia has done is created a way to insulate itself from Western sanctions. And one of the problems that the West have is because this is a tactic and not a strategy, it has only short term. Look at Iran. Iran has been under sanctions for years. It was under sanctions before the nuclear weapons deal. After the nuclear weapons deal has been under sanctions, and still they are able to create ballistic missiles, still they are able to create drones, still they're able to maintain stability in the government. And these tactics are not long-term strategies. And the tactic of trying to isolate Russia's economy was a 6-month tactic. If it didn't work in the first 6 months to a year, then ultimately it has failed. And what it has done is shown Russia how, and shown other countries how to disconnect themselves from the Western system. And we're going to talk about that in a minute when it comes to de-dollarization and BRICS. You're only creating a roadmap for future ineffectiveness of sanctions. Janet Yellen, to her credit, has pointed that out to the American government that, hey, by overusing sanctions, it's like overprescribing antibiotics. The more you prescribe it, the more immune countries become to sanctions. And that's essentially what has happened. Russia's economy grew in 2023 despite war and sanctions. Look at the other economies around the world. When you look at what happened in 2023, Russia's economy grew by 4.9. UK went into recession. The Eurozone as a whole had almost no growth to show for the entire year. The United States had some growth. Japan went into recession. Germany barely escaped a recession, but because of the sanctions on the fuel industry, the sanctions on natural gas and on natural resources coming out of Russia and the energy prices, Germany has crippled. I was reading an article the other day how Germany's industry will be crippled for a generation because of the high energy prices and the cuts and the impact that it's had on their economy. France France had nothing to show for the most part when you look at 2023. So when we talk about economic resilience, when we talk about the ability to withstand the attacks, the ability to withstand what is going on with sanctions, Russia has proven its strength, and in so doing makes itself a viable long-term partner for many in the global South seeking an alternative to the Western order. And they call it the Western rules-based order, but what we are seeing, this is the other thing. One of the other critical issues that we're seeing is that the rules-based order is coming under pressure itself. It's coming under pressure because it's becoming clearer and clearer that the rules apply to some, but not to others. One country can bomb civilians, and it's okay. Another country, it's a crisis, it's a genocide. One country can attack consulates, but another, it's okay. It's fine. It's defense. Some countries, depending on the who they are, their ethnic makeup, what part of the world they're in, have the right to self-defense, have the right to protect their borders, have the right to even engage in preemptive strikes. Other countries do not. And so this is a continuous back and forth where there are those who have the ability in the minds and the eyesight of the West to take action and to defend themselves, and those who don't have agency based upon the alliances that they. And so it's really not a rules-based order. It's a who's in charge and who's our friend. And what you're seeing now is that there's a move to try to create a counterweight. And as a part of that counterweight, this notion of isolating Russia has proven that it can be a crucial part of the counterweight to this biased rules-based order. Riding the storm, Russia's economic landscape since the Ukraine conflict. Essentially, it's proving to the world that even with sanctions, even with all of what's going on, even with the war, we are a viable partner in this new world, and you want to be friends with us. If you're not in the camp with the West, then you got to be in the camp with us. And so from a strategic standpoint, it is a strategic victory. Look at what's going on with BRICS. Countries are clamoring to join BRICS. Group South Africa says, as Russia takes up leadership, there are countries all over the world trying to join BRICS. This is BRICS alliance. Look at the strength that they have in the global economy. If the goal was to isolate Russia, that was one goal. The goal was to weaken Russia in its defense industry. That was another goal. The goal was to cripple its economy. That was another goal. All three of those things have not worked. And so clearly we have to say that there was a strategic defeat in each of those categories, and a strategic success by Russia in each of those categories. Even if it wasn't, the economy still struggles some in certain areas, ultimately the economy grew and it didn't collapse. The ruble didn't collapse. When you talk about partnerships, the diplomatic aspect of it, BRICS moved to expand and its move to de-dollarize are also a part of the strategic victory of Russia. And sometimes we discredit BRICS. I like to often show people that when we account for purchasing power parity, BRICS since 1995 has moved closer and have overtaken as a group the purchasing power that those countries have against the G7, not against the entire EU or not against the entire Western world, but against the G7, the BRICS nations, and especially when you go to BRICS Plus and you begin to add its newer partners, you're going to see that not only do they have purchasing power parity with many of the Western alliances, but they also have a hold on many of the natural resources that enable the world to function. And to add to that, the two biggest powerhouses in BRICS India and Russia. I've got a video I did, I think it comes out a little later on. It's a short talking about how India's economy is growing at a pace that it will become the world's largest economy eventually if it continues to grow at this pace. Now, it is true that as the economy grows, the growth rate will slow, but it is also true that having India with such a high growth rate, having China with such a high manufacturing, having Russia with such natural resource, when you start to put these countries together and you start adding in Iran and Saudi Arabia and you start adding in countries beyond South Africa, you're creating a counterweight to NATO and a counterweight to the EU that will be powerful. And Russia hasn't been booted out. Russia is playing not just a central role, but I think one of the pivotal roles within the BRICS alliance, helping to push it towards de-dollarization, helping to push the BRICS alliance towards the acceptance of new members, the acceptance of a digital currency. New BRICS member Iran, once again, another country that has been isolated by the West, calls for digital currency systems this year, not waiting. They want digital currency now. It's a move to unseat the power of the dollar and to create stability and to promote cross-border trade in local currencies without having to scramble for dollars and to be subject to the type of sanctions that Russia and Iran and others have been subject to. I think beyond the sanctions, the cutting Russia off from SWIFT and the seizing its reserves really is what is fueling this. It was a tactical, and I don't know if it was a tactical victory. It was, you have to give it a tactical victory. I don't know how successful it will be over the long term, but ultimately, even if you claim it as a tactical victory, it was a strategic failure, because it was a sign to China, a sign to the entire global South that you cannot trust the rules-based order, that if you run afoul of them, they will steal your reserves, they will reappropriate your resources, they will cut you off from the transaction system so that you cannot use SWIFT. While it was a tactical victory, it was clear that it was a strategic failure. And in that way, trying to weaken Russia tactically ended up weakening the West, weakening their hold over the global economic system. And so from Russia's standpoint, it was a strategic victory. You can't see it as anything else. BRICS prepares to launch currency in 2024. This year, the BRICS Pay site is up, and BRICS Pay will begin to have a digital currency that will use local currencies, not a new dollar, and that's really at some point, it doesn't have anything to do with the West or the U.S. It has to do with economic interest of the various countries. India has always been close to the United States, but it has its own economic interests, and it has to pursue those. And when you're able to transact in your local currency, it strengthens your economy. One of the main issues that you have throughout Africa and other places is the inability to acquire dollars to service debt at a reasonable price, a reasonable exchange rate. And so it weakens their local economy, which is one of the reasons so many of these countries in Africa in particular are moving closer to Russia, are moving closer to China, because they feel that they've gotten a raw deal. They want a better financial deal. They want partners that will not interfere in their local politics and prop up rebel groups and fund dissension within the countries and promote coups and assassination plots. They are looking for the type of partners that will not only foster growth within them, but become long-term partners militarily as well as economically. And Russia has positioned itself as a counterweight. They've gone to Africa and they've shown or have marketed themselves. They call it history diplomacy. They've shown we were not colonizers. Not only that, we have the same adversary, the same group that's trying to isolate you and undermine your economy is also, look what they're doing to us on our border. And that message is taking hold throughout the Sahel and throughout different parts of Africa. And so while it was an attempt to weaken Russia, isolate Russia. Russia on the world stage, I don't know how you can argue that they have been isolated. If anything, you hear more about new partnerships, new military partnerships, and economic partnerships with Russia now than you did before this effort, this conflict